Good day, everyone. I'm Arnold Ramjitsingh. Welcome to Issues in the Global Economy. The purpose of this conference is to discuss CW2, which is a continuation of CW1. Presently, there are 30 participants at the conference, so I'm going to hold on for a few additional minutes to enable more participants to join. As you know, CW2 is due in just a couple of weeks, and you might imagine that you would need a structure and so on, and all of that will be discussed at today's conference. Before we proceed to have a look at CW1, I would like to recap. Before we proceed to have a discussion on CW2, let's have a recap of CW1. Some ground rules, however. I have muted participants to negate external noise. At the end of this forum, however, there will be a Q&A session and you will be invited to submit your questions. I will be only too happy to respond accordingly. Before we review CW1, which is a precursor to CW2, as you're well aware, let me just check. Can you indicate, please, if you are hearing this audio clearly? There's a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and can you indicate, please, using the chat function, if anyone, can you indicate if you're hearing? Wonderful. Also, can you indicate if the video quality is clear enough, please? Wonderful. Good. So while we hold on for additional participants to join the conference so that more people can benefit from this session, let's have a review of CW1, which will inform the development of CW2. At CW1, we discussed the globalization process, the drivers of globalization, emerging economic opportunities and threats. Globalization, you would recall, refers to the integration of markets. Today, countries, continents, and companies are inextricably connected, interdependent, interlinked, and so on, relative to 1 decade or 2 decades ago. There are two forms of globalization. The first is market convergence, and the second is dispersion of production. Market convergence refers to the homogenization of markets, a term coined by Professor Ted Levitt, who argued that cultural differences are vanishing and societies, people, and countries are converging and homogenizing. A great opportunity for multinational corporations to offer standardized products. A standardized product is one which contains uniformity and has global appeal. Consider, for example, the MNCs, Coca-Cola and Ford. Coca-Cola's products, their soft beverages, typically have standardized packaging, labeling. Their slogan, Open Happiness, is generally the same worldwide. For Ford as well, their two flagship products, the Ford Fiesta and Ford Focus, have generally standardized features. There may be minor nuances to cater for legislative differences around the world. A second form of globalization is dispersion of production, and this refers to the practice by which multinationals spread the production process across the globe, as opposed to traditionally having it confined to one geographic location. Consider, for example, Lenovo, the tech magnet. Its design is conducted in Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, California, whereas manufacturing is held in China, assembly in Mexico, web hosting services in India, and the product is sold worldwide. From CW1, you also learned that there are several drivers that accelerate this phenomenon known as globalization. The first is, and obvious, is information and communication technologies. These involve web-enabled technology, voice-over IP technologies, such as Skype and Zoom, what we are using today. Another driver of the globalization process is falling trade barriers, and these refer to protectionist policies that governments often erect to keep imports out of their countries. Typically, tariffs, non-tariff bargoes, quotas, and so on, that governments erect in a bid to protect the domestic economy. Many governments around the world have lowered their protectionist barriers with the assistance of the World Trade Organization that has dialogue with governments and countries to encourage the lowering or reduction of such protectionist barriers, which would make these countries more receptive to doing business, more receptive to international trade, the conduct of import and export with other partners, and so on. A final driver that had been discussed previously is advancements in transport, containerization, shipping, cargo, and so on. Presently, I see that we have 36 participants. Some time has elapsed. And at this time, I'm going to share the assignment brief, which was released by the UH for discussion. So in a minute or so, you will be able to see the assignment brief, which was previously discussed 2 sessions ago. Good. Could you indicate if you are seeing the assignment brief? Can someone send a message if you are seeing the assignment brief? Thank you for that. Okay, so this is the assignment brief that we are all familiar with. It's not new to us. It was discussed in class previously. As you see, this course is entitled Issues in the Global Economy. The course code is presented on the right. CW2 is a case study involving an evaluation of the impact of multinationals on host countries. This will be presented in report format. The maximum words is 2,000. However, there's a ceiling of 2,200 given a 10% margin. This assignment is worth 70% of the final grade, and it's due on April 9, 2020. More specifically, the UH has given some additional guidance. This assignment is entitled Impacts of Multinationals, a case study of developed and developing nations. There's a description lower down. It's as follows. It is believed that multinational corporations are always detrimental to their host countries. So effectively, your report involves an evaluation of this contentious statement. The statement is suggesting that MNCs tend to have adverse consequences on their host country, and you will be required to engage in debate, provide balanced arguments which will support or negate this thesis. In order to evaluate this statement, you are required to produce a case study of a chosen multinational underpinned by previous research. So this statement suggests that CW1 is a precursor and informs the development of CW2. The research that you compiled in CW1 involving the globalization process, the history of globalization, all of that information will be used to inform the construction of CW2. Once you have selected a multinational from the drop-down list we will look at in a few minutes, you are required to identify 2 host countries, one developed, one developing, and engage in critical discussion regarding the impact of that multinational on both those countries. Present a case study in the form of a report, generally follow the structure below. Let's examine the structure. The UH has very graciously, I would say, provided you with a nice structure. Many universities do not provide this detailed guidance, and it's very useful. According to the the recommended structure from the UH, we see that there are 4 clear sections: an executive summary, globalization and MNCs, the case study section, and your conclusion and recommendation sections. At the executive summary section, you're required to provide a scope of your case study. I will elaborate further and outline what will be discussed. The next section involves a history of globalization, the process of globalization, how has it affected the world's economy since 1970s, and the establishment of MNCs, involving a brief history and the role they play in the globalization process. The largest section of this report, as you see, a greater allocation of words has been provided for this section, involves a critical discussion of the impact of your chosen MNC on 2 countries. Firstly, you will begin with a brief background to your MNC. Select one from this drop-down list. I would strongly recommend that you avoid the overly familiar MNCs like Samsung and Coca-Cola. I'm not saying that you should not choose these, but it would be refreshing to have a discussion on a different MNC. So the module leader will be able to, I wouldn't say assign more marks, but it is something new that will be read as opposed to an entire litany of discussion on only Coca-Cola and Samsung. So try to be novel, I would say. Select a company that would separate and distinguish you from the rest. So there's a long list of MNCs in this link that you can access. And I really hope that the entire class has not chosen Samsung or Coca-Cola. Following which you will select 2 host countries from the UN URL given. I believe a distinction and a definition for developing nations as well as developed nations have been provided, including a list of developed and a list of developing nations that you will consider and research by providing balanced arguments of the impact of your MNC on both of these countries. You will also analyze policy implications, emerging issues, which I will discuss in a few minutes at greater length. Finally, your conclusion and recommendation sections. Summarize your report, present conclusions, recommend potential policies to prevent adverse impacts on your host countries based on operations of your selected MNC. So participants, what I have done is I have transposed that information and I have added to it to create a structure that should be useful to anyone for the development of CW2. So the proposed structure would involve an executive summary, which I will discuss, another section, globalization and multinational corporations, the largest section of this report, a case study of your MNC, which will involve 3 subsections, a background to your MNC, we will discuss, the impact on host countries, including 1, developing. Another section within this section is the impact on host countries, 1, developed. Another section within this section is emerging issues and policy implications, that areas that need strengthening. And finally, conclusions and recommendations. And I have some ideas here that you could consider as suggestions to mitigate the adverse effects of MNCs on host countries. But before we discuss the structure, a recap of the beneficial and adverse effects of MNCs. This is not new. This was discussed previously 2 Saturdays before for the Saturday cohort and 2 Tuesdays before for the weekday cohort. You would recall some of the positive impacts of MNCs involved: FDI and capital investment. FDI refers to foreign direct investment. This involves inflows of capital from the home country to the host country. It's typically substantial. It is used for initialization and the establishment of operations. So it's normally a substantial amount, an injection into the host economy, which tends to improve the GDP. It stimulates economic buoyancy in the economy. It encourages spending, investment spending, consumer spending, government spending, and so on. Another benefit of MNCs for host countries include job creation. This is indeed a contentious point. It is argued that MNCs create only operational type jobs, field type jobs for citizens of host countries, and the high-end executive, functional, strategic jobs are retained by employees in the home country, typically the expat workers. Another benefit that MNCs create for their host countries include export earning generation, reduction of import spending, improvement in the balance of payments. And this means when MNCs enter a foreign country and they begin production on foreign soil, those products are later exported. This generates a significant amount of export earnings that the host country will enjoy. Related to this point is a reduction of imports. Assume that country A, for example, was manufacturing product X. Was importing product X. If the MNC in question establishes operations at country A and begins to manufacture product X in the home soil, it means that country A is saved from incurring expenditure of the import for product X. So two related points here are export earnings, an increase in export revenues, a reduction in import expenditure, and collectively, these improve the balance of payments for the host country. Participants, the balance of payments refer to a financial statement that all governments keep. It is a record of the country's import and export transactions with the rest of the world. When export earnings exceed import expenditure, this is a favorable position and it is referred to as a balance of payments surplus. The converse occurs when import expenditures exceed export earnings, an undesirable position by all means, and this is referred to as a balance of payments deficit. So it is argued that MNCs often contribute to a balance of payments surplus in the host country. Another argument is tax revenues for government. Trinidad and Tobago generates the highest internal tax revenue from an MNC. That company is British Petroleum. The second highest tax revenue is also generated from an MNC. That company is British Gas. The third highest tax revenue for the government of Trinidad and Tobago is also generated from an MNC. That company is BHP Billiton. So we see a significant benefit for host countries when MNCs participate with their activities on foreign soil. Another benefit that MNCs provide to host countries is knowledge transfer. Transfers may include technical knowledge, managerial skill, the introduction of new technologies, new production techniques, new production systems, and so on. Another benefit is development of a sector, urbanization, modernization, and industrialization. Consider, for example, Ford, General Motors, and GE have established operations in Mexico, a traditionally rural country. The establishment of operations of these MNCs have modernized and urbanized several areas of Mexico. Some of the negative impacts that MNCs have on their host countries include repatriation of profits. So a lot of the revenues are repatriated to the home country. It is argued that MNCs exploit the environment of the host countries. There's a lot of evidence to support this thesis. Exploitation of people, a lot of evidence to support this thesis. Coca-Cola, the Gap clothing company, H&M, Primark, they have all been accused of exploitation, even in Europe. MNCs are able to transfer production to another country, leaving the host country worse off than before. The argument is that MNCs are considered to be free and footloose. They are non-committal. They are always in search of opportunities where production can be conducted at a lower cost. They are always in search of location economies, and they have no commitment, it is argued, to the government or to the citizens of any host country. They often create congestion, bottlenecks, strain on the limited infrastructure, especially in poor developing host countries. Some MNCs, it is argued, are more powerful than entire governments, and they can pressure governments to relax labor laws, environmental laws, and so on. So this is not an exhaustive list. Please conduct research to identify the impacts of MNCs on host countries. Some of your Google searches may involve the impact of positive or the impact of MNCs positively on host countries. Other searches may include negative impacts of MNCs on host countries. So please conduct research to identify reasoning behind the impact of MNCs on host countries. And this is not an exhaustive list. So we would want to use discussion as such in the construction of your report. As I have indicated previously, this is a structure that will be available to everyone subsequent to this conference. It is a development of the original UH assignment brief. Section 1, typically the first section in any report is an executive summary. It is recommended that 100 words be assigned to this section. And what should be discussed in this section? Well, firstly, you would want to establish the importance of the topic. What is the topic? The topic is this: impact of MNEs on host countries. So you would want to establish, participants, why it is important to discuss this issue. Participants, MNCs are well discussed in literature. It is argued that they have a lot of detrimental effects on their host countries. Less than 1 decade ago, as you're familiar, BP was accused of discussing a substantial amount of the reef of Mexico. The then President Obama, mandated that BP pay $100 billion to the government and to the people of the United States of America to atone for its actions. So clearly we see this is an issue that is important and it is worthy of discussion. So rather than beginning abruptly by saying the purpose of this report is to discuss X, Y, and Z, it is always recommended that you have an opening statement to nuance the discussion, an opening statement to establish the importance of the discussion, an opening statement to clearly tell the reader why this issue is one worthy of discussion. Next, it is recommended that you discuss or you tell the reader what you are about to do. So outline what the report will entail. So this will be something to the effect. Basically, it's a description of the sections of the report. So something to this effect might include: the purpose of the following discussion is to provide a brief overview of globalization and an introduction to multinational corporations. Following this, a case study will be ensued. It will involve a background to your chosen MNC. In addition, a critical evaluation of the impacts of MNCs on their host countries on both developing as well as developed countries will be conducted. Finally, emerging issues, policy implications, and recommendations will be made. So that is what you will do at this section: outline what will be discussed. And finally, you will summarize the scope of your case study. The scope of the case study refers to the parameters or the limitations of this study. This is not an exhaustive study. It is only going to discuss one developing country and one developed country. It will also discuss only one multinational. So those are the parameters, the limitations of this case study. It's not a discussion on home countries. It's not considering emerging, transitioning economies, etc. So this section is where you say that this report is limited to a discussion on one MNC case study, and one, it's confined to a discussion on the impacts of one, the impacts on one developed and developing country. Following this, you're required to briefly discuss the process of globalization as indicated several times in this conference. This assignment is a follow-up to CW1. So a lot of the information, you would recall, the process of globalization was discussed in CW1. Some of that information can be transferred, of course, not copied and pasted. You would want to paraphrase it a bit differently. How globalization has affected the world since 1970s. This was done at CW1. So this information will inform CW2. And here is when you begin your discussion on MNCs. You will define what an MNC is, give a brief history, their evolution. MNCs have been existing for more than 2 centuries. However, it has been in the last 5 decades that they have developed profusely. Discuss the establishment of modern MNCs, the sectors they impact, and the role of MNCs in the process of globalization. Participants, MNCs play a very instrumental role in the globalization process. They are responsible for the movement of capital, inflows and outflows of capital between home and host countries, between host countries. They are responsible for the movement of people between countries. They are responsible for the movement of products and services. MNCs also contribute to the globalization process by having standardized products which support Ted Levitt's theory of homogenization. MNCs also practice dispersion of production. So my argument is that MNCs have tremendous roles. They are important facets in this phenomenon known as globalization. The largest section is a case study on your identified MNC. I have disaggregated this section into 4 subsections, I believe. Firstly, you will discuss, present a background to your MNC, that's 200 words. Then a substantial discussion should be ensued on one host country, a developing country. I have assigned 555 words. This is not cast in stone. You do not need to follow this recommended word allocation. Another area that is a substantial aspect of your work is the impact on developed countries. So again, a substantial amount of words have been assigned. And the final area of this section is emerging, is emerging policy implications and so on. 200 words have been assigned. So in total, 200 plus 550 plus 550 plus 200 will be 1,500 words for this section. 1,500 words. It's by far the largest and most important section of your report. So the first subsection is give a background to your MNC. Firstly, you will briefly introduce your MNC. Identify one from the chosen from this drop-down list. Give a brief history of your MNC, how the MNC was established, in what year, how it has developed over time, the amount of years experience your MNC possesses, its operational scope, sectors in which it operates. That means whether it's a pharmaceutical sector, auto sector, retail sector, and so on. Main product categories, for example, the Toyota MNC has several product categories, including flatbed trucks, sedans, executive luxury vehicles, sport utility vehicles, and so on. These are their main product categories. Scale of operations. So how large is this MNC? The amount of employees, amount of continents and countries in which the MNC operates, whether it's incorporated as PLC or an LTD, its asset base you would want to discuss. That would give an indication of the size of this MNC. What is the value of the MNC's assets, current share price, main customer segments, and so on. Following this, a discussion on your host countries should be conducted. So you can choose to discuss either the developed country first or the developing country, really 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, it doesn't really matter. If you choose to discuss your developing country first, it would be recommended that you begin with a definition of a developing country. You can find this on the UN's website or any other credible source of information. Identify one developing host country in which your MNC operates from this list. Discuss and analyze the positive impacts and outcomes on society. See last page. The last page refers to the discussion that was held earlier. These are some of the positive impacts. By no stretch of the imagination is this an exhaustive list. These were some of the negative impacts. By no stretch of the imagination an exhaustive list either. So in your discussion, analyze the positive impacts. You can choose from that page or any other points you've researched. And I recommend 2 points max, meaning you should not attempt to discuss all and sundry. You cannot discuss all of this in 550 words. I would imagine that you would select 1 or 2 points at a maximum, define, explain, discuss the outcome, impact, effect on the society of the country of your choice. So let's say you choose FDI. If you're MNC, one of the main benefits to the host country is its injection of capital flows, investments, and initialization funding, and so on. Discuss that fully. I would say about 200 words or so. Discuss the impact it has led to in the economy. It has made the economy more buoyant, increasing consumer investment spending, and so on. Conclude that point and select another point and discuss that. I would recommend only 1 or 2 positive points because you cannot discuss multiple points deeply. It is always recommended that you discuss a few points deeply rather than many points superficially. So again, you would want to discuss the positive impacts on your country. Indeed, this would require the use of data to substantiate your points. You would want to use numbers. If you say FDI is your point, then quantify what is the value of this FDI over what time period. That gives legitimacy and credence to your argumentation. Of course, please use credible information, no Investopedia, Statista, Wikipedia. Please use journal articles, conference proceedings, research publications from universities, information from reputable agencies, the WTO, the UN, and so on. Remember, this section is an evaluation on host countries regarding your developed country. Evaluation means present balanced arguments. So you're not only discussing positive points, you want to discuss negative impacts as well. See last page. So the last page again, these were some of the negative impacts. In a similar vein, please do not discuss multiple points. Select 2. Let's say 1 adverse consequence was repatriation of profits. Define, explain, illustrate, compare with other countries if you wish, provide data, discuss deeply, and then select 1 other point and discuss. So at the end of that discussion, it would be worthwhile for you to argue whether the MNC has been predominantly beneficial or predominantly detrimental to this host country. Meaning, yes, there were positive impacts, yes, there were negative impacts, but what was the predominant outcome? Was it overridingly positive or negative? And this can be determined by quantifying your arguments. Let's say a positive point was FDI, and assume this was the value of $2 million, but the negative point was environmental degradation, and this was to the amount of $10 billion. We could compare negative and positive, and we see the net effect was predominantly detrimental. So this can be determined by quantifying your points and so on. And you would want to compare the impacts of your developed and developing country? So can you please indicate if you're still hearing me? Please just um, respond using the chat function. Anyone, if you're still hearing this. Thank you so much. So again, this is by far the largest section of your report. A case study on an MNC. You begin by a background to your MNC, and then you want to provide a critical evaluation on host countries, one developing, we have discussed that, and one developed. In your developed section, again, define what is a developed country. Typically, with a higher GDP per capita, you will find a nice definition for this. Discuss again the positive impacts. Discuss also the negative impacts using information from the last page. Discuss 2 points max, 2 points max. Now, how you can toggle this is maybe one positive and two negative, or two positives and one negative. And this really depends on what your research findings reveal. If, for example, your research suggests that General Motors, yes, positively contributed to job creation, FDI, and so in Mexico, but the negative impact was sweatshops, environmental destruction, and so on, and your research suggests that the negative effects outweigh the positive effects, then I would recommend you spend more time discussing negative and less time on positive. Perhaps one positive and one negative and two negative. Conversely, if your research suggests that Samsung, although I said avoid the usage of Samsung, if your research suggests that Samsung had a substantial amount of positive effects in India, FDI, job creation, urbanization, and so on, and the negative effects were negligible, then I would recommend that you discuss two positive points and one negative point. So remember, you only have 550 words to play with this section, and you have a lot of material to discuss. You have to discuss positive and negative. So it may not really be feasible to discuss two positives and two negatives together. Maybe one positive, two negatives, or two positives, one negatives, and you can toggle with that depending on what your research generates. Again, try to argue. I mean, this might be a bit difficult, but if you have data facilitates evaluation well. If you could find data to assign a numerical value for positive and a numerical value for negative, then you'll be able to quantify what was the predominant or net effect, whether positive or negative. At the end of your discussion, you will want to compare the effects on the developed and developing country, meaning from the preceding analysis. Now that you have discussed both developed as well as now that you've discussed developing and you have concluded your developed discussion, you will be in a position to compare whether the adverse effects on the developing country were greater than developed country, which is likely to be the case, whether the benefits for the developed country exceeded the benefits for the developing country. So you would want to compare the pros and the cons for both developed and developing. And that is important because that would inform the next section, emerging issues and policy implications. So what does this mean? It means from the preceding analysis, preceding is what has gone before, from the preceding analysis of the impact on your host countries, what were some of the emerging areas of concern? Meaning, having conducted this research, what are policy areas that require strengthening? environmental regulation, labor laws, general provisions made from the government, made by the government for the operations of MNCs in their country. So this is the output of your analysis. So you've evaluated the home and host country, and following the conduct of that evaluation, you are now in a position to say, okay, clearly there are issues, and these issues involve environmental, labor, tax avoidance issues. So you would be in a position to identify the emerging areas of concern and why do you feel these are emerging areas and why do they require strengthening? Why do they require intervention? So there's a logic to what is being discussed, you know. The preceding section is the evaluation of the impact on both countries. The output of that is policy implications, what areas need to strengthen and why, what are the areas of concern, and the output of that is your conclusion and recommendation section. So in your conclusion and recommendation section, what should be discussed? Think of the logic to what you're doing. If in the previous section it was discussed, yes, there are emerging areas of concern, there's exploitation and there is tax avoidance, tax evasion, and so on, then you will conclude, yes, a summary of your main research findings. So what were your main research findings from the preceding sections? From the preceding sections, try to avoid using the word concluded. So rather than saying it can be concluded, you should say research revealed or research identified. Research suggested that MNCs from the aforesaid research tend to exploit people, process, governments, and so on. So you would summarize your main research findings. What do you conclude? So logically, if you have identified that these are the areas of concern, obviously imagine yourself to be in the position of a consultant advising the said countries. You would then be required to make recommendations. So these recommendations are designed to respond to the emerging issues and policy implications. Whatever the areas of concern your research identified in this section here, you will now try to recommend, suggest methods, policies, solutions that countries can adopt to mitigate the adverse effects that your research has revealed. All of this can be reduced to one word: regulation. There are different categories of regulation participants. Government regulation, which is legislation. Self-regulation, you would hear your Prime Minister, well, my Prime Minister also, saying that we do not need to be beaten with a stick on our heads. We can govern self. MNCs can regulate their activities through the conduct or through the development of codes of conduct, codes of ethics. They can develop their environmental policies, a commitment, if you will. They can develop CSR campaigns, and all of these help to keep the operations and the activities of the MNCs in check, separate and apart from legislation. So granted, yes, legislation may need to be, if it is existing, it may need enforcement, it may need policing, or new legislation may be required to be enacted. But apart from government having to legislate and litigate, MNCs can regulate themselves through the areas we've just discussed. Apart from self-regulation, society can also regulate the activities of MNCs through the role of pressure groups, lobby groups such as People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, Greenpeace International. All of them can lobby, they can bring attention to negative issues at a global level, and they can place MNCs against the wall. So it's a sort of social pressure that they can apply to MNCs. Another form of regulation is international regulation. that which can be provided from intergovernmental bodies such as the G20, the G8, international treaties such as those that governments agree with the World Trade Organization, etc., and other such agencies. The International Labour Organization has standards of practice for how employees, workers, and so on are treated in many developing countries. So apart from domestic legislation, self-regulation, and social regulation, we can turn our attention to international regulation, the role of intergovernmental bodies, international treaties. Countries can sign on to international treaties. So they have the international backing from other institutions such as the ILO, WTO, G20, G8, and so on. The role of the WTO and the, well, I didn't have it here, but the BWIs. The BWIs play an important role in regulating the MNCs, the activities of MNCs, and also the role of trade associations and unions to protect the sovereign interests and rights of employees. So these can be recommendations, again, participants. It is not possible to discuss all of these under the sun with only a ceiling of 200 words. I would recommend you select one and discuss it deeply. Select any one, or maybe at most 2 points. Discuss how these have been used. It would be very good indeed. If you can find actual examples of how MNCs, let's say in other jurisdictions of the world, how they have regulated self through the development of codes of conduct, codes of practice, codes of ethics, and what was the outcome? Did it curb? Did it mitigate poor practice? Find examples of regulation from society and so on. Find examples of jurisdictions in which there was a strong union presence. Trinidad and Tobago, the Caribbean in general, because of our colonial history, we have a strong presence of unions in our countries, and so they can take on the MNCs because of the number, the membership that they have, the strong historical presence that they have in such countries, as opposed to the US, where the history of unionization is less practice relevant to other jurisdictions. So these are some of the areas you would want to discuss. I would like to just recap this area because this is the largest section of your report. It's called a case study on your multinational corporation. It is recommended that this section be disaggregated into distinct subsections or paragraphs. The first is you present a background to your chosen MNC. This is some guidance on how you can do so. This has been transposed from the original assignment brief, and I added a few points of my own. The next subsection is a critical discussion on the impacts of MNCs on one developing country. You would present a balanced set of arguments using both positive and negative points. Some of these can come from this last page. I also urge that this is not an exhaustive list. Please conduct research to identify points of your own, which you will use to present a balanced argument, both positive and negative impacts on your developing country. This should be a deep discussion. Identify the issue, define and explain the issue. Meaning, if you choose to discuss FDI, identify, define, say what it is, use data to quantify the value, what was the outcome and impact on society, the social effects, improvement in the standard of living, improvement in consumer spending, improvement in the quality of life, etc. Provide data and evidence. Also, it will be useful, although you are considering one country, it is always useful to compare your results with another country that experienced a similar finding, then discuss the negative effects. I recommend no more than 2 points max. You can toggle between 2 positive and 2 negative. It can either be, I would say, 1 positive, 2 negatives, or 2 positives, 1 negative. And this really depends on what your research reveals. If your research suggests that there have been more positive effects, then by all means, discuss more positive, spend more time discussing the positive. If your research reveals that there have been more negative effects, then by all means, assign fewer words, perhaps only 1 short paragraph on the negatives. And after you have done so, you would want to try to say whether the net effect has been predominantly positive or negative. You repeat that process for one developed country of your choice. Following the evaluation of both developed and developing, you are now in a position to identify what are the areas of concern, what are the areas that policy needs to be improved or strengthened. Has your research suggested that MNCs repatriate all their profits overseas and none is kept in the host country? Then this may suggest that there is a need for legislation of how much money MNCs are allowed to repatriate and so on. So this section here is the output of your previous section, in which you are now in a position to identify what are the areas of concern, what areas require strengthening, and this should not be fabricated. This is the output of your previous research. Having identified the areas that require strengthening, the areas of concern, the emerging issues, having done that, you are now in a position to propose, recommend, suggest strategies, policies, methodologies that can be utilized to negate or to mitigate the aforesaid areas of concern. Some of the recommendations may include these, and generally, all of this can be reduced to one word, which is regulation. Different forms of regulation: domestic legislation, self-regulation, social regulation, international regulation, regulation from unions, and so on. Do not attempt to discuss all. Select 1, 2 max and discuss them as fully as you can. So you have a nice thorough structure that you can use to create your report, which you should begin working on with immediacy. Good. So that concludes the tutorial section of this conference. And as indicated before, I'm providing a forum in which you can ask questions and I will respond. So there's still interaction. Please feel free. You can use the chat forum. You can use the chat forum to ask any questions. That you wish. So at this time, the floor is open. Please, I'm inviting any questions from the participants. Good. So I see we have some questions here. Good. So deadline for review. That's the first question, the deadline for review. So, so the deadline will be determined and you will be informed subsequently by email, but please be mindful that this is an individual assignment and the class is fairly large. So you need to permit me with a fair period of time to provide reviews. So I will indeed be providing reviews and you'll be notified in due course. There's another question here. Do you have any deadline to submit for review? Right, so that was that question was asked previously. So are there any other questions that you would like to ask? Please feel free. I trust that this structure, the new deadline, so a participant has asked another question. The new deadline for the UH is on the 13th. So that gives you 4 days extra, which is good, right? 4 days extra, so I'm happy for that. Do you have any additional questions? You have a nice clear structure. It's almost equivalent to what I would discuss in class in a physical forum. So this can replace what you're accustomed to some degree. Also, please remember to use credible sources of information and try to use your best standard of English language. Use Harvard Protocol for your referencing. How soon, another question, how soon would the recording be available to us? I would say within the next 24 hours or so. Another question from Sheldon, you had mentioned using an abstract. If so, how long should it be? Sheldon, no, an abstract is not part of this report. An abstract was not recommended by the UH. The UH has 4 sections in the assignment brief, and those 4 sections I maintained in my development of the structure. So no, there's no abstract. I would not recommend that at all. I would begin with the executive summary and follow the sections recommended by the UH. Another question we have, if there's only one major negative for one of the countries, is this okay? Yes, this is absolutely okay from Natalie. And you see, this really depends, Natalie, on what your research findings suggest. Natalie, would you care to say who is your MNC? Could you type in who is your MNC? Nestle, good. So from your research, Natalie, on any of your host countries, can you say what your research findings have revealed thus far? Did you find evidence that the impact of Nestle on those countries were more positive than negative, or did the negative outweigh the positive? What did your research reveal so far? More positive or more negative, Natalie? Did you see more positive or more negative? More positive. So great, Natalie. If that is your case, then in response to your original question, I would spend more time discussing positive, maybe 2 positives and maybe only 1 negative, because that is what the research findings suggest. And then you will be in a position to conclude that the overall effects were predominantly positive. It would be helpful if you could quantify using actual figures to give credence and legitimacy to your point. So that's an excellent question. Yes, by all means, Natalie, discuss more positive, discuss fewer negative. So we're getting quite a lot of questions from Dana, when you will be sending the structure for us. So the structure is what we have discussed for the last hour. Also it will be available when the video is available for public consumption. And if you wish, I can also distribute it by email, Dana, so that's not a problem at all. From Brandon, thank you, sir, for your guidance. Brandon, you're welcome. And advice, as usual, thank you so much. Even in the current light, thank you, Brandon. Other questions, we have a lot of questions from Adish. Yes, email would be great, Adish. Sure. So yes, before this evening is over, I will circulate it by email. From Crystal, thank you, sir. You're welcome. You're welcome, Crystal. Any additional questions? Do you have any queries, concerns? Please feel free. I see another statement from Natalie. Nestle always has a commitment story in regards to any defamation. Good. So Natalie, I'm getting that your research suggests more positive than negative. So we have additional questions. So let's keep the interaction going. From Tasha. Tasha, based on my preliminary research, the company has created more negatives than positives in both developed and developing. Should I emphasize the negative? Absolutely yes, Tasha. And that is the logic. That is what your research suggests. You are not. It is important that your research present the objective results, meaning not what you want to see. Your research should reflect what the findings suggest. So if your research suggests predominantly negative, by all means, you would want to discuss, I would say, 2 negatives and only 1 positive. And you can make such a statement in your report. You could predicate your discussion by saying research findings have revealed that impacts have been more negative and there have been fewer positives, or the negative impacts have outweighed the positives. And by all means, you should say that. Tasha, a message from Farah. Thanks so much, Farah. You're welcome. You're welcome. From Vinity. Yes, Vinity. Hi, sir. Could you kindly repeat the date to submit for your review? Vinity, I haven't determined the date. However, we do know that you have been granted an extension from the UH to the 13th. Bridget has advised us of such. And the date for review will be provided to you in due course. I will send out an email. Thank you for your guidance. It's definitely helped in terms of clarity. You're welcome, Vinity. Do we have additional questions? Anybody would like to? From Rihanna. Thank you, Sue, for this guidance. Rihanna, you're welcome. From Sunita, thank you, Sue, for this guidance. Sunita, you're also welcome. From Ramona, thank you, you're welcome. I am always happy to help students. I would really like you to get the maximum score. Do we have any additional questions? Please feel free to ask any question. From Kemba, thank you for sharing the structure. I really appreciate it. You're welcome, Kemba. I know you will do good work. Do we have any additional questions? Marina Hayes, your presentation is always effective and efficient. Thank you. Marina, you're very welcome. Any additional questions, students? From Marielle, thank you. It's extremely beneficial. From Christine, thank you. Your session was very useful. You're welcome. You're welcome, Marielle. You're welcome, Christine. From Bridget, okay, thank you. You'll be getting the structure via Word. Yes, Bridget. This entire conference is being recorded and it will be available subsequently to this live session, and I will circulate it by email before the afternoon is out. From Natalie, is negative or positive pictures recommended? Natalie, do you care to specify what do you mean by pictures? Do you mean images? What do you mean? Would you like to say? Natalie, positive pictures. Or do you mean pictures in the appendices? Child labor pictures. So if you wish, yes, you can include photos in the appendices. Always remember, Natalie, that the appendices, they are optional. The reader is under no requirement to view the appendices. But yes, you can add photos if you like. Also, you could include diagrams and charts in your report. I would recommend keeping photos at a minimum in the body of your report, but by all means, you are free to include them in your appendices. Great, thanks, you're welcome. Dana, from Dana, always excellent presentation from you, Sue. Thanks for sharing. Dana, you're most welcome. Do we have any additional questions, concerns that you would like to ask? From Safia, thank you, Sue, for the session, very useful. You're welcome, Safia. So we have a lot of questions, a lot of participation here. It just demonstrates that also, although we are in remote locations, it doesn't necessarily impede the interaction. So there's a lot of interactivity. Still, students are asking questions. I've received questions from about 20 students thus far. There's a lot of exchange. Before we conclude, anything that you would like to ask, any additional questions, concerns? Also remember, this is 70%. If you want to, so you have the opportunity to score a really high mark. It's really independent work. Try to provide deep and credible research, use data, use the evaluation process that I taught you. Always have critical discussion, compare with the effects in other countries, compare with best practice, and so. Good. So the questions are waning off at this time. And before we conclude, I would just like to open this forum again one more time. Is there anyone who has any questions, concerns, areas of clarification? From Natalie, recommendations are not our personal ideas. So the research, yes, absolutely, Natalie. Recommendations are not to be opinion based. In fact, this report, not a single sentence in this report should be opinion based. If you want to give your view, it must be predicated on research findings. I would definitely avoid the use of language such as I, me, my, we, and so on. You always want to use the personal pronoun. So the recommendations should be based on best practice, what other countries, other jurisdictions have done, Natalie, and those would be the premise or the foundation of your recommendations. So as you say, you're quite correct. Solely research. From Bridget. Bridget, would we be receiving results from CW1 before CW2? Typically, that's what would happen. The university would want you to be informed of your strengths and your weaknesses so you can incorporate your strengths into your CW2 and you can improve on your weakness for CW2. So yes, they would indeed release the results, and not only the results, they will provide feedback on what your strengths and weaknesses were so you can utilize that information in your CW2. So absolutely, Bridget, we have a question from Tasha. Can a comparison be made with other MNCs? Yes. But be mindful, Tasha, that this is a case study, meaning you would want to have the majority of the information on your MNC, let's say maybe 80% on your MNC, but leave room for comparison with other MNCs. Let's say, Tasha, if you are making the point that Nestle exploited rivers in sub-Saharan Africa, you can indeed compare with Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is an MNC that has been accused of similar issues. So indeed, you could compare. You could also compare with benefits. You can also compare with emerging issues. You can also compare with recommendations. So Tasha, if you want to say that BP is a MNC and following that environmental tragedy, BP rebranded from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum, suggesting that the MNC had gone beyond their traditional remit of energy and they had rebranded to an environmental company. So Beyond the Petroleum. So again, yes, you can you can compare with best practice, Tasha, what other MNCs have practiced, and based on the outcome on what MNCs have done, this can indeed be a recommendation for your MNC. Yes. So Tasha, indeed a comparison. Natalie, we have a question. Is it recommended in an argumentative essay to list the negative and positive? Is that a proper essay to follow? Yes, a critical essay always involves presenting the balanced arguments. And that is not my view. That has been given in the assignment brief. If you read the original assignment brief, Natalie, it says to present a balanced argument. So you want to provide both positive or negative, Oh, I see now. I think I misinterpreted your question, Natalie. You're asking if you should list the negative first and then the positive. I understand. So you're asking for flow. The general thesis on this matter, Natalie, is that it depends on your position. So let's say, Natalie, you indicated previously that Nestle, the data revealed that Nestle provided more adverse impacts than positive impacts. If that is the case, so you are taking to the position that it is more negative than positive, it generally follows that you should discuss the positive first, meaning one paragraph on positive, and then discuss the negative, spending more words on negative. So that should be the sequence. By contrast, let's say Samsung has operations in India and they were predominantly positive relative to negative, then the sequence would be discuss negative first with fewer words. I would say one paragraph, and then discuss the positive after. Imagine you are an attorney and you are in a court of law. Before you state your position, do you know what you would do, Natalie? You would debunk the position from the other attorney, meaning if you want to argue that your position is predominantly positive, then keep that for last, debunk the negatives, give a negative discussion first, and then spend the remaining of your words, the majority of your words, substantiating your position, which is that it is positive. I hope that this explanation clarifies the question. Natalie, please indicate. You can message, let me know. From Natalie, another question. What about the sequence for countries? Is it okay to speak about the impacts, one paragraph in and one paragraph out? I'm not sure I follow what you mean by one paragraph in, one paragraph out. Maybe you can clarify if you like. I'm happy to provide details. So we get a lot of questions from Natalie. While I hold on for Natalie, do we have other questions? So Natalie, do I speak about the developed first and only the developing, then the developing? No, Natalie, that is not a requirement. You are absolutely at liberty to choose your sequence. You are free to discuss developing first, then develop after, or develop first, then developing after. You are absolutely free to make that determination. Great. We have lots of questions. Lots of questions. Okay, Natalie, you responded great. I'm happy that the clarification was helpful. Do we have additional questions? So there's an abundance of questions. I'm happy that the participants are really engaged. I'm happy to see your level of engagement. I'm happy to see your level of interaction. I'm also happy to see your level of questioning. Yes. Do we have any additional questions from Sheldon? In the case where MNCs cause destruction to the environment, would it be beneficial to use relevant theories? Oh, absolutely, Sheldon. This is an excellent point. I'm happy you reminded me of this. So participants, Sheldon has asked a very pertinent question. You would definitely, and I cannot emphasize this adequately, you would definitely want to integrate a discussion of theory. You would definitely want to integrate a discussion of theory in your report. So various theories that you learned, the Kuznets curves theory, and that theory shows a correlation between education, income, and environmental destruction, which could be applied to both developed and developing countries relative to your MNC, meaning that the Kuznets theory suggests that MNCs are unlikely to have environmental destruction in developed countries because the level of education in developed countries is higher and they would be pressured to conform to environmental standards. Whereas in developing countries, the Kuznets curve theory suggests that lower levels of lower levels of development and consciousness would create holes for MNCs to exploit. So yes, definitely, the Kuznets theory, race to the bottom theory, the pollution haven hypothesis theory. So again, Sheldon, yes, indeed an excellent question for participants. If you're logged in at this time, you definitely want to integrate theoretical theoretical discussion in your report. Thanks again for that question. Excellent question, Sheldon. So let's keep the questions coming. We've had almost 40 questions so far. Do we have any additional questions? Please feel free. The floor is open. You are invited to discuss, raise any questions, concerns, areas, anything that you would like to ask. While I wait for additional questions, in the original assignment brief, it is recommended that your sources of information should be no less than 15. I would like to recommend 20. So your reference list should be no less than 20. And the general standard of practice is that you rely on website information at a minimum, meaning I would say at a minimum 10 journal articles, 5 ebooks, and 5 references from credible websites like the UN, IMF, World Trade Organization, your company websites, etc. So that was stated in the assignment brief, a minimum of 15 references, which I would like to increase to 20, And again, please try to rely more on credible sources of information. So students, before we conclude this conference, let's just summarize what was discussed. At the commencement of this conference, we reviewed CW1 because CW1 is a precursor to and informs the development of CW2. We also discussed the original assignment brief provided graciously by the UH2U, and we discussed my structure, which is a transposition from the original assignment brief, which I also developed by adding a few additional points. We recapped the pros and negative impacts of MNCs on host countries. We also discussed at length a structure that many of you have said so far you are very grateful to receive, and I'm happy to provide it to you. So we've also discussed the structure. I have also engaged in a Q&A forum. We have had almost 40 questions. You received responses to them. Thanks again for your questions. Some of you have asked if the structure will be released. Indeed, it will be released as part of the video, which should be available online in the next 24 hours. And apart from that, I will make the structure available by email before the evening is out. Okay. Right, so I think that concludes our Q&A session. We have had a very very interactive session with a plethora of questions, and I fielded those questions. Good. So participants, I'm going to conclude this conference. Thank you for your participation. We've had a number of people who logged on to the participation. Thank you for your engagement, your levels of engagement. Thank you for logging on for 1.5 hours. I know you could be easily distracted, but thanks for your engagement, your enthusiasm, for your interaction, and for your questioning. I think we've had from Sparkle, thank you, so you're welcome, Sparkle. From Sheldon, excellent job. Thank you so much, Sheldon. Thank you so much, Marielle. Thank you, Rihanna. Thank you, Lavon. Thank you. So participants, I'm going to log off now. We will conclude this section. Thank you, Nisa. So I'm going to conclude this conference, and I hope that it has benefited you and you can perform at your best ability. Thank you. Do have a good afternoon. I'm signing off at this time.